Afternoon all. I thought we could look at the very interesting game in round 12 of the World Championship Candidates Tournament of 2014, where Veselin Topalov was playing white against Peter Svidler. Veselin kicked off with e4 and Peter Svidler chose the Sicilian defence, and the variation we get is actually looking like the Taimanov after e6, c takes, knight takes d4. This is Sicilian Taimanov territory. Knight c3 is played here, queen c7. So not minding, I think it doesn't matter about knight db5 here. If knight db5, the queen could just drop back relatively safely here. And you might think, is there a way of exploiting that? g3, knight f6, doesn't really matter about bishop f4, knight e5 is okay. So this is a perfectly playable system for those interested. So let's go back. Knight b5 wasn't played. Instead we see bishop e3, which is the top move actually in this position. Black now played a6 here, so depriving white of that b5 square now, but also b5 is going to be useful usually for black under the right circumstances. Now here the most usual move is queen d2. Also bishop d3 is fairly popular. This is another popular move, bishop e2 though. Now black played b5. Often knight f6 is seen here. I've got over 1,000 games in my book with knight f6, but b5 is also second most popular. Now white takes on c6, and usually the queen just takes on c6 here. Peter Svidler actually chose a bit of a rarer continuation, d takes c6, and it's an interesting position with d takes c6 structurally. This c file, black has just closed his own semi-open c file, and one of the great things about the Sicilian defence is often that c file pressure. So to voluntarily close it, and this bishop is even looking at its own pawn here, it seems a bit on the odd side in some respects. From an engine perspective, white does stand a little bit better here. Now Veselin Topalov plays actually a4, and you might think this is also a little bit strange, because if you think about it, one of the perks you'd think of playing d takes c6 is to strengthen b5. This structure is stronger with a pawn on c6, but a4 being played anyway. And here this is where Svidler committed to playing b4, and I've looked at this particular position in some depth here if b4 wasn't played, and it seems there might be a viable alternative in bishop b7, although it looks a little bit strange until that bishop's liberated to play this. There's another idea of rook b8. Let's have a look at rook b8 first. It seems after a takes, c takes, and white castling, knight f6, this queen and bishop configuration might be a little bit dangerous for this diagonal, but white can also just play e5 here. This is another problem with black's position, that this knight has been driven back here. If knight d7, f4, this looks like a promising attacking position for white, with knight e4 perhaps on the cards later as well. And if queen takes e5 here, bishop a7, and it seems this gives white an advantage to do this based on that backward a6 pawn, so it's disruption based on a6. And in this position white can actually get by force a good position by taking on a6. Now b5 is loose and white's got a small advantage here. So it seems that the alternative in at least rook b8 doesn't seem that convincing, to put the queen and rook on the same diagonal, and also a6 is a bit of a target sometimes. Now bishop b7 looks to be viable for black here. This kind of position looks a little bit more viable indeed. Say bishop d6, looking at h2, f4, e5 as an example. This should be okay for black. Now I question this because I thought the move b4 is quite committal. Black's not only closed his own semi-open file pressure, it seems now that the c4 square has been weakened, and White plays knight b1, and it looks as though there's a simple rerouting to c4, where the c6 pawn is shielding that c4 knight. So it looks as though White has achieved a very comfortable looking knight now coming to c4 after c5 f3 preparing knight c4, and White does seem to have a small clear advantage. A nice knight on c4 like this, shielded by Black's own pawn on c5, is a bit of a pest. Any pawn on a5 later, well, that's going to be a continual target. There's pressure on the dark squares, so if a pawn comes to e5 later, there's going to be pressure. It just looks like a very, very useful, nice knight now on c4, and the position doesn't seem to have a Sicilian feel to it from a Black perspective without that c-file pressure. So anyway, knight d7 was played, queen c1, and I think queen c1 helps support bishop on f4 being protected, because if White had castled here, well, does this work? Knight e5, is that possible? Actually, bishop f4 is still good here. There's no tactic or anything. That's okay. So not strictly necessary, maybe from that perspective at least, to play queen c1. Given that knight e5, yeah, White could just castle here. Knight e5 isn't a big deal. But the other point is the knight can come to b6. So queen c1, though, does have ideas of, for example, c3, and maybe taking, and maybe b3 later. The queen can actually come on this diagonal potentially. Bishop e7 was played, and both sides castle. And then we see bishop f4, encouraging Black to fix another pawn now on e5. If the queen moves, this looks very, very comfortable now for two pieces of White. Looking at all the dark squares here between them, and for example rook d1 and bishop d6, this is looking very nice and pleasant for White indeed, getting rid of the dark square defender. Pawns fixed on dark squares. It just looks like a big advantage positionally for White. Actually, e5 was played instead, a kind of lesser evil move, but it is a potential target. If White later plays something like this and the queen's on that e5 pawn, this could be a target. So bishop g3, and now Black played h6, which I think has some ideas of bishop g5. I think Svidler, though, in the post-mortem was not sure that this was right to play h6, because for example, knight e3, there's always bishop g5 to pin against the queen right now. It might not have been entirely necessary to have played h6 in this position. Black might even consider a5, it seems, from an engine point of view. a5 is viable, but it still seems comfortable for White on these light squares. Okay, so h6 was played, and now c3. So White now can also try and fix the b pawn and give the option of either taking, or just leaving it there for a bit, but when taking, queen b2 then will become an option. So there's a big focal point on e5 coming up. a5, as though bishop a6 to challenge this knight. Now White actually plays queen c2. So if bishop a6 in this position, the queen on c2, by the way, is now protecting e2. So bishop a6, I think White can almost consider knight e3. This might be okay to play knight e3 here to unpin and try and get that d5 square. This might be slightly okay for White. I think that's one of the ideas of queen c2. But bishop a6, we see the actual concrete move that's played now, actually. And funny enough, it wasn't knight e3. You'd think that d5 is quite a useful square to jump to, but an even stronger move technically was played by Veselin Topalov. Although knight e3 is one of the top engine moves, the actual top one was played, which was actually to play rook fd1. White doesn't actually mind the replacement, and for Black to lose the light square bishop, Black will be weaker then on all these light squares if black voluntarily gives up the light squared bishop. And I think this pin might actually be tactically backfiring under certain conditions here. A move like rook ad8, yes, it seems as though almost knight takes e5 is dangerous with this pin kind of backfiring a bit. Bishop takes, rook takes, queen takes. This apparently is pleasant for white, this exchange sack idea. It's crazy stuff. If the rook moves here, white's going to be picking up material with knight takes f7, getting the exchange back with interest. So yes, it seems as though black needs to be cautious here about this bishop on e2, looking at his own bishop on a6. Black played the other rook to d8, leaving the bishop protected. And we see now b3, fixing b4. Now we see bishop g5. There's an interest, it seems, in this diagonal potentially if it's taken for the bishop to come here. Bishop f2 is played. And now actually this bishop on g5 is prone to eviction with an h4 at some point. And also white is still potentially now playing c takes to try and either encourage an outside passed pawn, or on c takes this d5 square for the rook could look at a5 potentially. Knight f8 is played, and now white actually does play c takes b4. So a takes b4 gives white an outside passed pawn, but this might actually be technically the lesser evil decision here for black. If, for example, h4, bishop e7, knight e3 looking at d5, knight e6, black has got that d4 square even if white has d5 access. And this might actually be, this sort of position might actually be okay for black. Say knight d5 here, queen b7, engines have it as about equal. This might actually have been the lesser evil decision. Instead, Peter Svidler took with the c pawn, and these pawns are a bit vulnerable, especially a5. This fifth rank is a way of getting to that a5 pawn. For the moment there's a forcing move here as well. Bishop b6 is played, so forcing black to capture on d1, giving white that d-file control for a moment. Queen b8. Now here there's a little trick. If bishop takes a5, then bishop takes c4 is very good for black, winning material. So actually white played a much stronger move, bishop f2, and still now carries this idea that the a5 pawn is potentially vulnerable for rook d5. So a5 pawn is, if that pawn's knocked out, then b4 is weaker, but also e5 is vulnerable here with the queen, so it would be a double attack, a rook d5 at the moment. Also, of course, knight b6 is dangerous as well, for various reasons, like getting a knight to d5 with tempo, and the queen coming down the c file. So this is a very dangerous position now after bishop f2. Peter Svidler played queen c7, which might not be the best move technically for maximum resistance. In this position, instead of queen c7, bishop d8, it looks passive, but rook d5, so we've got a5 protected here, knight e6, say g3, bishop c7. White is doing very well though in this position, but is the advantage necessarily completely winning here? Is black trying to hold down successfully e5 and a5? Is this actually possible? I think white can slowly build on this position though, and white does have a significant positional advantage. In the game though, queen c7, in this position, queen c7 was played, and we see now, in fact, rook d5, a5 is put under great scrutiny in this position. In fact, what does actually black do against this? if he tries to protect a5, I mean with bishop d8, I think this can still just be, this can actually be taken here, because if bishop takes c4, we've got rook takes a8, winning for white. If we move the bishop to try and protect a5, then actually rook takes e5 is now possible. Also rook c5 could be handy, and here rook takes e5, so rook c5 might even be better to put the queen there, and white's just won a centre pawn for not much. So a very difficult position now after this rook d5. There's pressure on these two sensitive points. Peter Svidler played rook c8, and now white actually takes time to actually kick the bishop with h4. Let's see if this sets up that pin. So if rook takes a5 here, then queen takes a5. We've got that pin. So here, this is great for black, because rook c1 check as well. 96, black is the exchange up and doing very well. So no, that's not the way to play it, to take the pawn immediately. No, instead some caution, h4, and where is the bishop going? If the bishop goes to f4, I think we can try and trap the bishop with g3. So the bishop goes actually to e7, and now unpinning with queen d2. So a5 is looked at again with great scrutiny for either knight takes a5 or rook takes a5 being possible. Black now played rook d8, pinning like that, the rook for a moment. But here, things are starting to dismantle for black after bishop b6. We see an exchange of one pair of rooks, but leaving the queen now as a substitute for the rook, looking at these two weaknesses. Queen b8, black is being dismantled. Queen takes a5. That is an extra solid pawn and represents a strong passed a pawn. What does black do now? He makes a further concession in giving him his light square bishop. If he plays bishop b7 here, then he loses the other pawn. Queen takes e5 is possible. So he has to concede his light square bishop, it seems now. Or does he? Well, actually, I don't know. This is looking lost actually for black. Queen b7. It's just looking like a lost position. Bishop f2. White can slowly consolidate. Bishop f1 later, and then look at e5. So anyway, black decided to play the committal bishop takes c4. So white has now the bishop pair and a fantastic light square bishop. Queen d6 is played, looking at the first rank. Bishop f2 now. This check is thrown in. King h2. White's king seems fairly safe here. And actually black resigned actually at move 35, which many of you might be a little bit surprised with. So let's follow this through. Let's say queen d2 to be a nuisance. White can just move the bishop actually, or even stronger apparently is queen a7, try and evict the queen later with queen e3 perhaps. So say let's move this bishop somewhere. Oh, we've actually also got queen f7 mate in 3 there. Queen f7, just for those interested. If here, queen g8, bishop f7. So the light square bishop is making itself felt in this variation actually, on f7 as well. That's pretty bad. So if queen d8, then we start working with the passed a pawn. So say knight d7 a6, this a pawn is just winning basically. It seems. So white can actually proceed, say with queen a8, now threatening a7. It's convincing enough, it seems here. Bishop takes h4, a7, and the queen is on the way, or winning material. Okay, so it does seem like a hopeless position here. Queen d2, so queen a7, very, very strong, protecting, also attacking here, coordinating. Let's look at another possibility, though. Knight g6, h5, and then when winning material. And if black doesn't do queen d2, well, I think it is fairly hopeless. If, let's say, knight e6, try and get something going against the king side in theory. Queen a7 again is pretty strong. If we move the bishop back, we just start moving the a-pawn again. It's a similar scenario. The a-pawn is not too far from queening, really. And if black can't generate any significant threats, it's over. The knight's kind of tied down to f7 again here as well. So queen takes is crashing through here. Again, it's just not very nice. This light square bishop is actually forcing a mate, actually. Okay, so yeah, it seems like a positional advantage led to white winning a pawn and then collecting the bishop pair, and then black threw in one check and realised here perhaps that it's pretty hopeless. This a-pawn and the queen and the bishop in particular are instrumental for a relatively straightforward way of winning this position, it seems. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.